The incident. Diana Matthews sat in her car, the faint hum of the engine the only sound in the quiet night. The streets of Atlanta were mostly deserted, a stark contrast to the chaos she had spent the day untangling. As an FBI agent specializing in corruption cases, her work often demanded her attention long after regular hours. Tonight was no exception. She had just wrapped up reviewing hours of surveillance footage, her mind still replaying fragments of conversations she had overheard during her latest investigation. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. She wasn't paranoid by nature, but the intensity of her current case left her uneasy. A high-profile corruption probe had revealed links between a city council member and a narcotics ring. Diana had spent months piecing together evidence, each clue leading her closer to unveiling a network of criminals operating both within and outside the law. She had expected resistance, but not the silence that came when she requested additional resources from local authorities. Something wasn't right, and it gnawed at her instincts. The sharp flash of red and blue lights pierced the calm of her drive. Her pulse quickened as she glanced again at the mirror, catching the unmistakable silhouette of a patrol car behind her. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run a red light. There was no apparent reason for a traffic stop. Taking a deep breath, Diana slowed her vehicle and pulled over to the side of the road. Her training kicked in. Stay calm, stay professional, and never let them see you rattled. The officer approached her vehicle, his stride deliberate. As he reached her window, she rolled it down, her face calm but alert. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady. The officer, a tall man with a sharp jawline and cold eyes, leaned in slightly. "License and registration," he barked. His tone was clipped, his gaze lingering on her with a scrutiny that felt invasive. Diana handed over the documents without hesitation. "May I ask what this is about?" "You were swerving back there," he replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Everything okay tonight?" Diana felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't swerved. She had been driving carefully, her mind too focused on the case to allow for anything reckless. Her instincts whispered that this wasn't a routine stop. Still, she forced a smile. "I'm fine, officer. Just tired from a long day." The officer nodded slowly, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he gestured toward her car. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle. Step out, please." Diana froze. The search? On what grounds? "I'm sorry," she said carefully, "but do you have probable cause? I haven't done anything wrong, and I'd like to understand the reason for this request." The officer's face darkened. "Ma'am, you're not in a position to question me. Step out of the car." Diana's heart pounded, but she knew she had to stay composed. Her badge, tucked safely in her bag, felt like both a shield and a weight. If she revealed her FBI credentials now, would it protect her or escalate the situation? Deciding to play along for the moment, she opened the door and stepped out, her posture confident but unthreatening. As the officer instructed her to stand by the hood of her car, Diana's mind raced. She had nothing to hide, but the air around this stop felt wrong. Moments later, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. The officer was crouched near her driver's seat, his hands moving in a way that made her stomach drop. He was planting something. A cold wave of realization swept over her. Drugs. He was framing her. Diana's training and instincts collided. She couldn't confront him outright. He was armed, and there were no witnesses around. She also couldn't let him succeed. Her reputation, career, and life were on the line. As he stood up, brushing his hands off, she met his gaze, her expression neutral despite the fury building inside her. "All right, ma'am," he said smugly. "Looks like we've got an issue here. Step over to my vehicle." Diana followed his direction, her mind already formulating a plan. She wasn't just dealing with a corrupt cop. This was deliberate. Someone knew who she was, and this was no coincidence. But who was pulling the strings? And how deep did this go? As he began cuffing her, his grip unnecessarily tight, another patrol car pulled up. Two more officers emerged, their faces unreadable. One of them carried a flashlight, and the other already had handcuffs in hand. Diana felt her chest tighten as they moved closer. "You're under arrest," the first officer declared. "Possession of a controlled substance." Her blood boiled. She wanted to shout, to pull out her badge and demand answers, but she knew better. This wasn't just about her. It was about the entire case she was working on. These officers were part of something bigger, and if she didn't play her cards right, she might not get the chance to expose it. As she was pushed into the back of the squad car, her mind raced. She needed to find out who was behind this, and why. And most importantly, she needed to get out of this mess before it was too late. This was no ordinary stop. This was war, and Diana Matthews was just getting started. Into the abyss. Diana Matthews sat in the back of the squad car, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back, her mind working overtime. The cold metal pressed into her wrists, a stark reminder of her precarious situation. Outside, the Atlanta streets blurred as the car sped away from the scene of her arrest. She kept her breathing steady, trying to suppress the anger and fear bubbling inside her. This wasn't her first time in danger, but this felt different, personal, targeted. The first officer, the one who had orchestrated this, Officer Malcolm Chase, sat in the driver's seat. His smug expression was reflected faintly in the rearview mirror. Next to him, another officer sat silently, his face unreadable. Diana made a mental note of every detail she could observe. Their badges, the route they were taking, and the faint scent of tobacco that lingered in the car. Her training had taught her that in moments of crisis, information was power. But right now, her power felt limited. She wasn't just dealing with a bad cop. This was something far more sinister. The drugs planted in her car weren't random. The timing of her arrest wasn't coincidental. She had spent months digging into a sprawling corruption network, and now it seemed the web was pulling her in. The car turned sharply, jolting her against the door. Diana frowned as she glanced outside. They were leaving the main roads and entering a more industrial area. Dimly lit warehouses and abandoned lots blurred past the window. This wasn't a route to any precinct she knew of. Her heart began to race. Where were they taking her? "Where are we going?" she demanded. Her voice steadied despite the growing unease. Chase didn't even glance back. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied with a smirk. Diana clenched her jaw. She had dealt with men like Chase before, arrogant, abusive of their power, and drunk on the idea that they were untouchable. But she wasn't a civilian they could intimidate into silence. She was an FBI agent, and she was trained for situations exactly like this. As the car pulled into a desolate warehouse parking lot, Diana's pulse quickened. The building was enormous, its walls rusting and covered in graffiti. The faint glow of a distant streetlight cast eerie shadows across the lot. Chase killed the engine, and the two officers stepped out, leaving her alone in the back seat. The cold night air seeped in as they opened her door and yanked her out. "Move," Chase ordered, shoving her forward. Diana complied, her mind racing. She needed to think several steps ahead, but the situation was spiraling quickly. They led her into the warehouse, the sound of their boots echoing on the cracked concrete floor. The air inside was damp and smelled of mildew. The faint hum of machinery somewhere in the distance added to the oppressive atmosphere. In the center of the vast, dimly lit space was a makeshift interrogation area. A table, a few chairs, and a single bright light hanging from a chain. Diana's gut tightened. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't a police station. This was an off-the-books operation. They shoved her into a chair, her hands still cuffed. Chase leaned against the table, his arms crossed, his smirk unwavering. "Let's make this simple," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're caught. We found drugs in your car. It's an open and shut case." Diana's eyes narrowed. "You and I both know those drugs were planted," she shot back, her voice cold. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Chase's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, I know exactly who you are, Agent Matthews," he said, leaning in closer. "And that's why this is going to be so much fun." Her stomach dropped. He knew. He knew she was FBI, and yet he wasn't backing down. That meant one thing: he had backing. Someone higher up was protecting him, orchestrating this. This wasn't about petty revenge or an overzealous cop. This was a coordinated attack. "You think you're untouchable because you have a badge," Chase continued, his voice low and menacing. "Out here, that badge means nothing. You've been digging where you shouldn't, and now you're going to pay for it." Diana stared at him, her expression unreadable. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Instead, she focused on gathering information. His words confirmed her suspicions. This was connected to her investigation. But who was pulling the strings? The second officer, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. Diana noticed the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't as confident as Chase. She filed that observation away, knowing it might be useful later. Chase straightened up and gestured to the door. "Keep an eye on her," he said to his partner before walking out. His heavy footsteps echoed as he disappeared into the shadows. The silence that followed was deafening. The second officer stood a few feet away, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Diana studied him carefully. He was younger, his uniform slightly ill-fitting, his posture less assured. He was nervous. "What's your name?" Diana asked, her tone softer than before. The officer hesitated, glancing toward the door Chase had exited through. "Why do you care?" he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Because you don't look like someone who's comfortable with what's happening here," she said evenly. "You know this isn't right." He shifted again, his hand tightening on his belt. "Just shut up and stay put." Diana pressed on. "You think Chase cares about you, about your career? He's using you. Whatever he's caught up in, it's going to drag you down with him." The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Diana could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't fully on board with whatever was happening, and that was her opening. "Listen to me," she said, lowering her voice. "I'm not some criminal. I'm a federal agent, and I'm investigating corruption within law enforcement. If you help me, I can help you. But if you stay silent, you'll be complicit in everything Chase is doing." He glanced toward the door again, then back at her. "I don't know anything," he said quietly, but there was a crack in his voice. "You don't need to know everything," Diana replied. "You just need to do the right thing." Before he could respond, the door slammed open, and Chase strode back in, a folder in his hand. He slapped it onto the table, his smirk returning. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're going to sign a confession. You're going to admit to being part of a narcotics operation. And then you're going to disappear." Diana's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about framing her. They were planning to eliminate her entirely. But she wasn't going down without a fight. "I'd rather die than give you what you want," she said, her voice steady. Chase chuckled. "Oh, don't worry. That can be arranged." Diana's heart pounded as she stared him down. She needed to find a way out, and she needed to find it fast. Whatever was happening here was bigger than her, and if she didn't survive, no one would ever uncover the truth. A crack in the facade. The silence in the warehouse was suffocating after Chase's chilling threat. Diana Matthews sat rigid in the chair, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Her mind raced as she analyzed every detail, every potential weakness in the situation. Chase's smug arrogance was his greatest flaw. He was overconfident, believing he had complete control. That gave her a glimmer of hope, but she needed to act carefully. One wrong move, and her life wouldn't just be ruined. It could end. Chase hovered by the table, flipping through the folder he had brought in. The second officer, who Diana now recognized as younger and less seasoned, stood awkwardly by the door. He avoided making eye contact with her, but glanced nervously at Chase every so often. Diana noticed his hand wasn't on his holster anymore. He was conflicted, and that was her way in. "Let me guess," Diana said, her voice calm but sharp. "That folder is full of fabricated evidence, conveniently found just in time to paint me as the criminal." Chase's lips curled into a smirk. "Fabricated? Please. These are airtight documents. Witness statements, surveillance footage, you name it. Once you sign the confession, no one will question it." Diana raised an eyebrow. "And who exactly are these witnesses? Or did you just scribble some names on paper and call it a day?" Chase's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "You don't need to worry about that. What you need to worry about is how much worse this gets if you don't cooperate. I've dealt with people like you before." Diana shot back, her voice steady. "Corrupt, power-hungry, and desperate. You think you've got it all figured out, but you don't." Chase slammed the folder onto the table, his smugness giving way to anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Agent Matthews," he growled, leaning in close. "You're in over your head, and no one's coming to save you." Diana locked eyes with him, unflinching. "You're wrong about that. You might control this little setup, but the truth has a way of surfacing. And when it does, you and whoever you're working for will regret this." Chase straightened up, his expression hardening. "That's enough," he barked, turning to the younger officer. "Keep an eye on her. I've got things to handle." He stormed out, leaving Diana and the younger officer alone. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the warehouse. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Diana and the door. She took a deep breath, knowing this was her chance. If she could plant the seed of doubt, she might get him on her side. "What's your name?" Diana asked softly, her tone less confrontational than before. The officer hesitated, then mumbled, "Grayson." "Officer Grayson," she said, testing the name. "You don't seem like the kind of person who's okay with what's happening here." Grayson glanced at her, then quickly looked away. "I'm just following orders," he muttered. "Orders from Chase." Diana pressed. "Do you even know why he's doing this? Why he's so desperate to frame me?" Grayson didn't respond, but the tightening of his jaw told her she was getting through. "I'm an FBI agent," Diana continued. "I've been investigating a corruption ring for months. Chase isn't just a dirty cop, he's part of something much bigger. And if you stick by him, you'll go down with him." Grayson's eyes flicked back to her, uncertainty etched across his face. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Diana countered. "He's trying to silence me because I'm close to uncovering the truth. But here's the thing, Grayson, if I disappear, the people I work with will come looking. Do you want to be the guy who helped a corrupt cop cover his tracks, or the one who did the right thing?" Grayson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He took a step closer to her, lowering his voice. "If what you're saying is true, why didn't you call for backup? Why are you alone?" Diana exhaled, her gaze steady. "Because the corruption runs deep. I couldn't risk tipping anyone off. But now that I'm here, I need help. You can help me." Grayson hesitated, his conflict evident. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence broken only by the faint hum of machinery somewhere in the warehouse. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need me to do?" Diana's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "First, I need you to uncuff me. Then we need to get out of here. If you help me, I can promise you immunity. You won't go down with Chase." Grayson stared at her, his internal battle written all over his face. After a long moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. He stepped behind her, fumbling slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. As the metal fell away from her wrists, Diana rubbed her sore skin, grateful to finally be free. She turned to Grayson, her expression serious. "Thank you. But we're not out of the woods yet." Before Grayson could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Chase was coming back. Diana acted quickly, grabbing a metal pipe from the floor nearby and slipping into the shadows. Grayson stayed where he was, visibly nervous. The door burst open, and Chase strode in, his expression dark. "What the hell's going on in here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Diana was no longer in the chair. Grayson stammered. She got loose. I don't know how." Before Chase could react, Diana emerged from the shadows, the pipe in her hands. With a swift, calculated strike, she knocked the gun from its holster, sending it skidding across the floor. Chase spun toward her, his face a mask of rage. "You're going to regret that," he growled. Diana squared her shoulders, the pipe still in her grip. "No, Chase, you're the one who's going to regret this." The standoff was tense, the air crackling with potential violence. But Diana wasn't afraid. She had been trained for moments like this, and she wasn't going to let Chase win. The battle for survival had truly begun. The turning point. Diana Matthews held her ground, the cold steel of the pipe firm in her hands as she faced Officer Chase. The warehouse lights flickered, casting ominous shadows across his furious face. Chase was caught off guard, but not for long. His hand instinctively reached for his now empty holster, his expression darkening as he realized his weapon was out of reach. "You're making a big mistake," Chase growled, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Diana didn't flinch. Her training had taught her that fear was an enemy she couldn't afford. She met Chase's glare with a calm intensity, every muscle in her body ready for what might come next. Behind her, Officer Grayson stood frozen, his expression torn between panic and indecision. He was the wild card in this tense standoff, and Diana needed to ensure he didn't falter. "Step aside, Grayson," Chase barked, his focus shifting momentarily to the younger officer. "You don't want to be a part of this." Grayson's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted between Chase and Diana, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For a split second, Diana saw the hesitation in Chase's demeanor. He wasn't just angry, he was worried. That realization sparked something inside her. Chase might have power, but he wasn't invincible. "You think I'm the one making a mistake," Diana said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're the one who's cornered. The evidence you fabricated won't hold up, and once this mess reaches my colleagues, your entire operation will come crashing down." Chase smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think your FBI badge makes you untouchable. Out here, it's just a piece of tin. No one's going to believe your word over mine." Diana took a cautious step forward, keeping her grip on the pipe steady. "Maybe. But I don't think you planned this as carefully as you think. Your arrogance is your downfall, Chase, and people like you always slip up." Before Chase could respond, the distant sound of a vehicle's engine reached their ears. The unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the warehouse, growing louder with each passing second. Chase's head snapped toward the door, his confident facade cracking. "Who's that?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. Diana allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. "Looks like your backup plan just fell apart." Chase's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he snapped at Grayson, then stormed toward the warehouse entrance. As soon as Chase was out of earshot, Diana turned to Grayson, her tone urgent but steady. "This is our chance. If you're going to help me, it has to be now." Grayson hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. I don't know. This wasn't supposed to happen. I just wanted to do my job." "And you can still do the right thing," Diana urged. "Chase is using you, Grayson. If you stand with him, you'll go down with him. But if you help me, I'll make sure you're protected." Grayson swallowed hard, his internal conflict playing out on his face. Finally, he gave a small nod. "What do we do?" Diana exhaled in relief but didn't waste time. "First, we need to find a way out of here. Do you know if there's another exit?" Grayson nodded. "There's a back door near the loading dock. It's usually locked, but I've got a key." "Good," Diana said. Let's move before Chase gets back. They made their way toward the rear of the warehouse, their footsteps careful to avoid drawing attention. The faint hum of machinery and the occasional drip of water were the only sounds around them. The oppressive atmosphere of the warehouse seemed to grow heavier with each step, but Diana remained focused. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. As they reached the loading dock, Grayson pulled out a keyring with shaky hands. He fumbled for a moment before finding the right key and inserting it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing the cool night air and an empty alleyway beyond. "This way," Grayson whispered, motioning for Diana to follow. They stepped outside, the scent of damp asphalt filling their lungs. Diana glanced around, her senses on high alert. The alley was dimly lit, the glow of a distant streetlight barely reaching them. She couldn't shake the feeling that Chase would catch up to them at any moment. "Where does this lead?" Diana asked. "There's a side road that connects to the main street," Grayson replied. "If we can get there, we might be able to flag someone down." "Good," Diana said. "Let's." A sudden shout interrupted her. "Hey!" Chase's voice bellowed from somewhere behind them, and the sound of heavy footsteps followed. Diana's adrenaline surged. "Run!" she shouted, grabbing Grayson by the arm and pulling him forward. They sprinted down the alley, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. The sound of Chase's pursuit was unrelenting, his shouts growing louder. Diana's mind raced, calculating their options. The alley was narrow, with nowhere to hide, and the main street felt agonizingly far away. As they rounded a corner, Diana spotted a stack of crates near the side of a building. She quickly gestured for Grayson to stop. "Get behind those," she whispered. "I'll draw him away." "What?" "No," Grayson protested, his voice filled with panic. "You can't." "Do it," Diana snapped. "I'll be fine." Grayson hesitated, then reluctantly obeyed, ducking behind the crates. Diana turned back toward the alley they had come from, gripping the pipe tightly. Chase's footsteps grew louder, his shadow stretching along the ground as he closed in. When he rounded the corner, Diana was ready. She swung the pipe with precision, aiming for his weapon hand. The impact sent his gun clattering to the ground, and Chase let out a grunt of pain. "You're making this worse for yourself," Chase snarled, lunging at her. Diana sidestepped, using his momentum against him. He stumbled, but quickly recovered, his fury driving him forward. Diana knew she couldn't overpower him for long. She needed to buy time for Grayson to escape and for herself to find another way out. "Give it up, Matthews," Chase spat, circling her like a predator. "You're out of options." Diana smirked, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Funny. I was just about to say the same thing." Before Chase could respond, the distant wail of sirens reached their ears. Both of them froze, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Chase's eyes widened, and for the first time, Diana saw true fear in his expression. "You called for backup," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Diana didn't answer, but the smirk on her face said enough. The sirens grew louder, their approach unmistakable. Chase's confident demeanor crumbled, and he took a step back, his gaze darting around like a trapped animal. Diana watched him carefully, her grip on the pipe unwavering. The tables had turned, and Diana Matthews wasn't about to let Chase escape justice. Not now, not ever. The reckoning. The wail of approaching sirens echoed through the narrow alley, a sharp contrast to the oppressive silence that had blanketed the night. Diana Matthews stood firm, gripping the pipe in her hands like a lifeline. Officer Chase, who had exuded nothing but arrogance and malice, was now visibly shaken. His once cocky smirk was gone, replaced by the realization that his reign of terror was about to collapse. Chase's eyes darted toward the darkened street at the end of the alley, searching for an escape. The rhythmic pulse of blue and red lights began to reflect off the damp walls, signaling that time was no longer on his side. Diana could see the panic in his posture, the stiff set of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his holster even though his gun lay discarded on the ground between them. "You've lost, Chase," Diana said, her voice steady and low. "There's no way out of this." Chase's lips curled into a snarl. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "You think those sirens mean help is coming for you. They could just as easily be mine." Diana's grip on the pipe tightened. She knew Chase wasn't bluffing. His web of corruption likely reached far beyond what she had uncovered. But she also knew she couldn't let fear cloud her judgment. "Then why do you look so scared?" she challenged, taking a step closer. Chase opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of boots crunching on gravel cut him off. Grayson emerged cautiously from behind the stack of crates, his face pale but resolute. His hands were empty, his stance hesitant but determined. "I've called them in," Grayson said, his voice shaking but clear. "They're not here for you, Chase. They're here to clean up this mess." Chase's face twisted in fury, and he turned his glare on Grayson. "You idiot," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've just ruined your career. And for what? Her." Grayson swallowed hard but didn't back down. "For doing the right thing," he replied, his tone firmer now. "I'm not going to be part of your corruption." The distant sound of car doors slamming and authoritative voices calling out orders reached them. The sirens had stopped, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chase looked like a cornered animal, his options dwindling with every second. Diana glanced at Grayson, her eyes narrowing. "Is it IA? The FBI?" Grayson shook his head. "Local cops. But I made sure to request backup from officers outside Chase's precinct. They won't be on his payroll." Diana nodded, relief flickering through her. For once, the odds might actually be turning in her favor. "Good work," she said, her voice low. Chase let out a bitter laugh, drawing their attention back to him. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You think bringing in a few clean cops is going to make a difference? You don't know how deep this goes. Why don't you enlighten us?" Diana shot back, her voice sharp. "You're going down either way. You might as well take the others with you." Chase's sneer faltered for a moment, his eyes darting between Diana and Grayson. For the first time, he seemed to realize he was outnumbered, not just in numbers but in conviction. His hand twitched, and Diana tensed, anticipating his next move. Before Chase could act, the alley was flooded with light. Several officers, their guns drawn, moved in quickly and efficiently. Their expressions were grim, their postures professional. Diana raised her hand slowly, the pipe clattering to the ground. Grayson did the same, his gaze darting nervously between the officers and Chase. "Drop any weapons and step back," one of the officers barked, his voice echoing through the alley. Chase hesitated, his jaw clenched. Then, with a sharp, frustrated growl, he raised his hands, stepping away from his discarded gun. Two officers moved forward, one retrieving the weapon while the other began to cuff him. "You're making a big mistake," Chase snarled as the cuffs clicked into place. "You have no idea what you're walking into." The officer holding him didn't respond, his expression stony as he led Chase toward one of the patrol cars parked at the alley's entrance. Another officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, approached Diana and Grayson. "Agent Matthews?" she asked, her voice measured. Diana nodded. "That's me. And this is Officer Grayson. He's been instrumental in exposing Chase's corruption." The officer's eyes flicked to Grayson, her expression softening slightly. "You're both coming with us," she said. "We'll need full statements, and we'll take it from there." Diana exhaled, the weight of the night finally beginning to lift. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "You've just saved more than my life tonight." The officer nodded curtly. "Let's get you out of here first. Then we'll deal with the rest." As they were led to the patrol cars, Diana couldn't help but glance back at the warehouse. The dark, oppressive building loomed like a shadow, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. But she wasn't done. Chase's capture was only the beginning. She still needed to unravel the network he was part of, and she wouldn't stop until every thread had been pulled. As the patrol car pulled away from the alley, Diana leaned back against the seat, her mind already piecing together her next steps. Chase had underestimated her. He had thought she was just another victim he could silence. But he was wrong. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Unveiling the network. As the patrol car navigated the dark streets, Diana stared out the window, her mind racing. The city lights blurred past, but her thoughts remained sharp and focused. Chase's cryptic warning echoed in her ears. "You don't know how deep this goes." He had tried to break her resolve, but instead, he had only ignited her determination. This was bigger than Chase. He was just a piece of the puzzle, a cog in a much larger machine. Sitting beside her in the patrol car, Grayson was silent, his hands fidgeting in his lap. His earlier courage had given way to visible anxiety. Diana glanced at him, sensing his unease. "You did the right thing back there," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It takes courage to stand up against someone like Chase." Grayson nodded slowly but didn't meet her eyes. "I didn't know it would get this bad," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could just keep my head down, follow orders, and it would blow over." Diana sighed. She had seen this before. Good people caught in bad systems, paralyzed by fear and a sense of helplessness. "It's not your fault," she said. "But now that you've made a stand, you have to see it through. Chase wasn't acting alone, and if we're going to take this operation down, I'll need your help." Grayson finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "Just tell me what to do." The car pulled into the precinct's lot, and they were escorted inside. The bustling energy of the station was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the warehouse. Diana felt a flicker of hope as she was led to an interview room, but she remained cautious. Even here, she couldn't be sure who was on her side. A detective entered the room shortly after, his expression professional but wary. He introduced himself as Detective Harper, an investigator from a neighboring precinct who had been alerted to the situation by Grayson's call. "Agent Matthews," Harper began, taking the seat across from her. "I've reviewed some of the preliminary details, and it's clear this situation is complicated." Diana raised an eyebrow. "That's putting it lightly." Harper gave a small nod. "You've accused Officer Chase of planting evidence and orchestrating a false arrest. We've already found inconsistencies in his reports and a hidden compartment in his patrol car that contained narcotics. It's not looking good for him." "That's a start," Diana said. "But Chase is just the tip of the iceberg. He mentioned that this goes deeper, higher up in the department. I've been investigating a corruption ring for months, and Chase fits the profile of someone being controlled by more powerful players." Harper leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. "Do you have names? Evidence?" Diana hesitated. She had pieces of the puzzle but not the full picture. The investigation had been stonewalled at every turn, and her arrest had derailed her progress. "Not yet," she admitted. "But I know where to look. Chase's operation will leave us to the others." Harper studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We've already impounded his car and started processing the evidence from the warehouse. If there's a trail, we'll find it." As Harper left the room, Diana leaned back in her chair, her mind still racing. She wasn't used to sitting on the sidelines, but for now she had to trust that Harper and his team would handle the immediate investigation. Her role would come soon enough. Hours later, as dawn broke over the city, Harper returned, his expression grim but determined. He carried a folder in his hands, which he placed on the table before Diana. "You were right," he said, his tone heavy. "We found encrypted files on Chase's laptop. It looks like he was receiving regular payments from an account tied to a shell corporation. The corporation is linked to someone you've probably heard of, Deputy Commissioner Alan Vickers." Diana's stomach dropped. Vickers was a prominent figure in the department, known for his public stance on cleaning up corruption. The revelation that he might be orchestrating a criminal operation was both shocking and validating. "I knew it ran deep," Diana said, her voice cold. "But Vickers, that changes everything." Harper nodded. "It does. But it also makes this more dangerous. If Vickers is involved, he has resources and connections that can make people disappear. We'll need to handle this carefully." Diana straightened in her chair, her resolve hardening. "We can't back down now. Vickers is the linchpin. If we take him down, the whole operation crumbles." Harper hesitated. "Are you sure you're up for this? After what you've been through tonight, no one would blame you for stepping back." Diana met his gaze, her expression fierce. "I've come too far to stop now. Chase was the bait, but Vickers is the real target. I won't let him win." Over the next few days, the investigation intensified. Grayson provided valuable insight into Chase's activities, confirming suspicions about how deeply he was embedded in the corruption network. Surveillance operations were launched, uncovering a pattern of suspicious transactions and connections that pointed directly to Vickers. Diana worked tirelessly, her exhaustion fueled by determination. She knew that exposing Vickers wouldn't just clear her name, it would dismantle a system of corruption that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. As the pieces began to fall into place, Diana prepared for the final phase of the operation. Vickers would be confronted, his empire exposed for the world to see. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was finally turning in her favor. For the first time in weeks, Diana allowed herself a moment of hope. She had survived the darkness, and now she was ready to bring it into the light. The confrontation, the day of reckoning, had arrived. Diana Matthews stood in the operations room of a secure FBI field office, her mind honed like a blade. The past few days had been a whirlwind of revelations, strategy meetings, and carefully executed plans. Deputy Commissioner Alan Vickers, once seen as a paragon of law enforcement integrity, had been exposed as the architect behind the corruption ring. Now the final step was to confront him and dismantle his operation. The room buzzed with activity. Agents reviewed blueprints, prepped surveillance equipment, and coordinated with law enforcement officials outside Vickers' jurisdiction. Harper had been instrumental in rallying honest officers from neighboring precincts, ensuring the operation couldn't be compromised from within. Diana leaned over a table covered in documents and photographs, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. The evidence against Vickers was overwhelming. Financial records, encrypted communications, testimonies from Chase and other coerced officers. Every piece painted a damning picture of a man who had used his position to build a criminal empire under the guise of reform. "Agent Matthews," Harper said, approaching her with a phone in hand. "The team is in position. We have surveillance on Vickers' residence and office. He doesn't know we're coming." Diana nodded. "Good. Make sure we're ready for resistance. He won't go down without a fight." Harper hesitated, his expression serious. "Are you sure you want to lead this? After everything you've been through?" "I need to see this through," Diana interrupted, her voice resolute. "This isn't just about me. It's about every officer he's corrupted, every life he's destroyed. I won't let him get away with it." Harper nodded, respect evident in his gaze. "Then let's end this." The convoy of unmarked vehicles moved silently through the city streets, their mission cloaked in secrecy. Diana rode in the lead vehicle, her thoughts a steady stream of focus and anticipation. The plan was simple but precise. Simultaneous raids on Vickers' residence and his private office, ensuring he couldn't escape or destroy evidence. The radio crackled to life as the team leader gave updates. Team Alpha, in position at the residence. No signs of movement. Team Bravo, ready at the office. Lights are on inside. Diana picked up the radio. "Both teams, proceed on my mark. Remember, this man is dangerous and well-connected. Stay sharp." Her fingers tightened around the radio as she issued the command. "Go." At Vickers' private office, Team Bravo moved swiftly, breaching the front doors with practiced precision. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the empty corridor as agents stormed inside, their weapons drawn. They found the office abandoned, but the computers were still on, screens displaying encrypted files that hinted at the scale of Vickers' operation. Agent Matthews, one of the team leaders, radioed in. "The office is empty, but we got a trove of digital evidence here." "Copy that," Diana replied. "Secure everything and keep searching. He can't have gone far." Meanwhile, at Vickers' residence, Team Alpha faced a more volatile situation. The sprawling estate was heavily guarded, with private security personnel attempting to block the agent's advance. Gunfire erupted as the team pushed through, neutralizing the guards and making their way inside. Diana arrived at the residence moments later, stepping out of the vehicle with her weapon drawn. The air was thick with tension as agents secured the perimeter. She entered the grand foyer, the marble floors and ornate chandeliers, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding. "Where's Vickers?" she demanded. "Upstairs," an agent replied. "He's barricaded himself in a panic room." Diana's jaw tightened. "He won't stay there for long. He's buying time to figure a way out." She moved quickly, her boots echoing against the marble as she ascended the staircase. Outside the panic room, a group of agents was working to bypass the security system. Diana approached, her presence commanding attention. "What's the status?" she asked. "We're almost through," one of the tech agents replied. "Just a few more minutes." Diana nodded, her focus unyielding. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Vickers was just on the other side of that door, the man responsible for so much pain and corruption. This was her chance to bring him to justice. When the panic room door finally swung open, Vickers stood inside, his hands raised in mock surrender. He was impeccably dressed, his suit unruffled, his expression smug. It was the face of a man who still believed he could talk his way out of anything. Well, Vickers said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Agent Matthews, I've heard so much about you." "Spare me the theatrics," Diana replied coldly, stepping into the room. "It's over, Vickers. We have everything we need to put you away." Vickers chuckled, lowering his hand slightly. "You think you've won? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? My connections go higher than you can imagine. You take me down, and you'll have a dozen others lining up to replace me." Diana's eyes narrowed. "Maybe. But today, you're the one going down. Your connections, your power, they mean nothing if you're behind bars." Vickers' smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Diana seized the moment. "You've spent years hiding behind your position, exploiting those who trusted you," she said, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "But now you're exposed. And when this is over, you'll be remembered not as a leader, but as a fraud." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Vickers didn't respond, his bravado crumbling under her gaze. "Cuff him," Diana ordered. The agents moved in, securing Vickers and leading him out of the panic room. As they descended the stairs, the full scale of the operation came into view. Officers were cataloging evidence, securing guards, and dismantling the infrastructure of Vickers' criminal empire piece by piece. Hours later, back at the field office, Diana stood in front of a board filled with evidence. The operation had been a success, but she knew this was just the beginning. Vickers' arrest would send shockwaves through the department and beyond. The cleanup would be long and arduous, but the first domino had fallen. Harper approached her, a cup of coffee in hand. "You did good, Matthews," he said. "Vickers is already singing, trying to cut a deal. He's naming names." Diana took the coffee, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start, but there's still work to do." Harper nodded. "There always is." As he walked away, Diana allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had been through hell, betrayed by the very system she had dedicated her life to. But she had fought back, and she had won. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would continue to fight for justice, no matter how high the stakes or how deep the corruption. Because if there was one thing Diana Matthews knew, it was that the truth was always worth fighting for.